Welcome to London Unwrapped, Sounds of a Migrant City, our year-long series exploring London's music story at King's Place, focusing on the part that outsiders and immigrants have always played in driving forward musical culture, from George Frederick Handel to Jimi Hendrix, from Felix Mendelssohn to Anna Meredith. And I'm joined by Richard Boothby of the viol consort Fretwork, who are going to play a night in November called Albion, reworking songs from Elgar to Napalm Death and everything in between with Gabriel Prokofiev for the unique colours and sounds of Fretwork's instruments. But look, Richard, thinking about London's musical history in the era of the viol consorts and before, so pre-1700, that we might think of the city's history the further back in time we go as being more insular and less cosmopolitan. But that's just not true, is it?
Oh, absolutely, not true at all. And especially for the history of the viol, it's a history of enormous influence from the continent. I mean, just the presence of viols in England at all could have been brought by. I mean, we don't know this for certain, but it could have arrived with Catherine of Aragon when she came to marry Henry VIII's brother Arthur in really the beginning of the 16th century. Certainly by 1520, the first documents we have evidence of viol players were three Dutch players who were at Henry's court, and that they were the original people that we know about who played viols. By the end of Henry's reign, he had I think 40 viols in his collection. So he was very keen on the instrument and very aware of the musical trends throughout Europe, and not at all interested in keeping Britain isolated. In 1540, one of the most significant events was him bringing two families of musicians from Italy, from Venice, who turned out actually to be Jewish musicians who had presumably fled the expulsion of the Jews in 1492, arrived in Venice as being a sort of relatively safe haven, and then were brought by Henry over to England, where in theory Jews weren't allowed to be until the middle of the 17th century. But these two families changed the musical style of viol consort music and much else. And set the foundation for the way in which the viol was used and played, and really were the people who made the viol very, very popular in England, more popular in England than any other country in Europe, in fact. And one could go further through the 16th century, in particularly Ferrabosco. Alfonso Ferrabosco was an Italian musician, came from Bologna, and worked at Elizabeth's court. He had a son who was also called Alfonso, and very shortly after the son was born, he wanted to go back to Italy, and Elizabeth said he could go back to Italy so long as he left his child here as insurance that he would come back. He went to Italy, he never came back. And Alfonso the younger, was brought up by another musician in the Queen's retinue, and became one of the most illustrious musicians of the early 17th century, writing music for Ben Jonson's masques and plays, and really founding a part of the musical establishment of Prince Henry in the early 17th century. So this confluence of particularly Italian. I mean, we were particularly interested in Italian musicians in the 16th and 17th centuries, but also from France as well. That was part of what London was being cosmopolitan, being welcoming, providing the basis for opportunity for very often refugees from other countries, persecuted for their religious beliefs or their literally their race in the case of the Jewish musicians, and so providing a safe haven, which is I mean, it's a very heartening story, really.
Was there such a thing then as London style, an English style that composers were interested in using, or was it rather the case that either that question simply wasn't particularly interesting to composers and musicians of that time, and it was more a sense of creating a hybrid with whatever the court and the instruments and the chapel royal and everything else that musicians would have had at their disposal? Were those kind of questions legitimate at that time, or was it really just this feeling we're going to do whatever we can with the influences that we find the most interesting?
Well, I think that musicians have always been open to every sort of influence and hungry for new ideas from different places. And of course, continental musicians were just as hungry for information about what was going on in England as vice versa. And I think that the indigenous composers like Byrd and Tallis, for example, were very, very keen to hear what continental musicians were doing. And one of the great exports for England was of viol players, virtuoso viol players, particularly at the end of the 16th, early 17th century. The really great viol players in the world, in Europe, were English viol players. And we find them all over the continent serving every monarch throughout Europe, and particularly there was a great viol player who served in Spain in the court in Madrid, and they seem to have no problem crossing these barriers in any way possible. And an English style was a mélange, a mixture of all the continental styles, because London was such a cosmopolitan place.
What about those composers, though, who are working with the English language? I'm thinking of a previous generation, John Dowland, who ended up making so much of his musical life in Denmark, but does then come back to work with James I. Doesn't get a position with Elizabeth. But what part does the language and song setting play, either for English or London-born resident composers, or indeed for other composers who are using the English language?
Well, I mean, yes, there's a great irony about Dowland, of course, because he establishes his reputation as a great lutenist and a great song composer in England with English words, and great English words, in fact, and yet his employment up until 1615 or so was entirely on the continent, in Denmark and in Italy and other places. And he did actually compose a few Italian songs setting Italian. And of course, Italian was the great land for musical innovation in the 16th century, and you find Byrd using setting Italian a few times. But I suppose that the English language is the point at which you might say there's an English style, because of course no one else was setting English. It was only English composers who set English words. And of course, this was the great time of some of the greatest English poets in the language, Shakespeare and Johnson and Donne and so on. And these poets were providing tremendous energy to composers of the time, and that goes right up to Purcell. And you see Purcell's unique. I mean, I think there's a quote about Purcell using I can't quite remember what it was said of him, but his unique ability to set English was remarked upon even at the time, and ever since has been the case. So I think the English language was the point at which the English could be said to have a style in that sense.
Other kinds of hybridity that Purcell and fellow composers just towards the end of the 17th century are working with semi-operas and the masks and those astonishing multimedia hybrids of theatre, dance, and music that are being put on at that time. But Richard, when it comes to your own instrument, I mean, Purcell's viol fantasies, that group of pieces which seem like, on one hand, a kind of summation of what's possible for particularly your fretwork and that lineup of viols, but also to a certain extent often are thought of as bringing a way of thinking about music and thinking about your instruments to a kind end. I mean, what happens to the story of the viols after that moment?
Well, I mean, Purcell's fantasies are fascinating from that point of view because all the indications are that they were never performed in Purcell's lifetime. There's just one unique manuscript, and there are no parts that have survived. So it's very likely that they were never performed in his lifetime, and that goes to the question of the place of the viol in Purcell's England. Really, it had come down to the bass viol as a continuo instrument and as a solo instrument to a certain extent. All this comes from Charles II's restoration, known to detest fantasies and not be interested in music he couldn't tap his foot to. So the complex nature of English consort, the counterpoint, was definitely something of the past. But it was something that absolutely animated Purcell in his 20th year, when he spent this summer writing out these incredible fantasies and innominates that he did. After that, what we see is the viol, as I say, is a solo instrument. The bass becomes a solo instrument, and by the beginning of the 18th century, has really lost an awful lot of musical importance, and it sort of goes underground for maybe 50 years or so. I mean, there are people playing it, but not really significantly until the arrival of Carl Friedrich Abel in about 1758. I think he arrived from Germany, and his virtuosity, again, an immigrant, a refugee from Germany, looking for musical financial opportunities, and he arrives and single-handedly revives the instrument, and really wows London's audiences with his playing and his musical sensibility. And that really is the high point of the viol in the 18th century. It doesn't actually die. There used to be a narrative that the instrument died with Abel, but it didn't. There were still people playing the viol all through the 19th century until it was revived by Dolmetsch at the end of that century. And so the viol has got a continuous history right from its inception until the present day.
Probably one final question, Richard, and then Leanne will have an encounter. Richard, your own concert. I mean, the thinking of the way the viols persist as a sound world. I mean, so many of today's late 20th and 21st century composers have written for your group specifically for fretwork, and you're working with 20th and 21st century songs in your program Albion. What's binding the program together?
Well, what's binding the program, what animated us to want to put this thing together was an investigation of British identity through music, British musical identity. And the idea was to take music or iconic pieces of British music from the year dot until yesterday and feed them through this quintessentially British ensemble of the viol consort, something that was more popular in England than anywhere else, and persisted longer in England than anywhere else. And so there's an Englishness or Britishness to the sound of the viol consort, and we wanted to see what that did to this notion of identity. And so we've got arrangements of pieces by everything from the Beatles through to Sailing By, and Napalm Death, and and Elgar and Purcell, and so on and so forth, to create a kind of tapestry that leads one through notions of Englishness, and to distort them, and to manipulate them, and to comment on them in that sense. So that it's a discussion. It's like history is always an investigation, a discussion. It's a never fixed thing. This is a way of animating that history.
So the latest station of the viol concerts function in hybridizing musical cultures and doing it for where we're all going to be in November 2021. Richard, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.